something happened that I want to walk you through carefully. Iran just halted every single petrochemical export in the country, $13 billion a year, plastics, fertilizers, polymers turned off, redirected inward, and everyone is calling it an economic story. I want to argue it is not. It is a signal, and China has seen that signal before. The last time a country made that exact move, what came next changed the entire global order. There are three things happening right now that most people are treating as separate stories. They are not separate. They are the same story. Here's the first thing. Iran is closing its economy. Here's the second thing. America is calling that a victory. Here's the third thing. China knows what comes next. And understanding why those three things are connected is the key to understanding where this war is actually going. Let me walk you through all three carefully. Let me start with a number, because this number is the thing that should stop everyone. Iran's petrochemical sector generates $13 billion a year in export revenue. It is Iran's single largest source of non-oil income: plastics, fertilizers, polymers, agricultural chemicals. The Mashhar complex and the Asaluya plants together produce roughly half of it. A senior official at Iran's national petrochemical company just issued a directive to every producer in the country: stop exporting immediately. Every cargo not yet cleared called back. All supply redirected inward until further notice. That is not a temporary pause. That is a country closing its second largest revenue stream to protect its domestic supply, while it is already facing a 12-year economic recovery, while it is already under a naval blockade, while ceasefire talks have no confirmed second round. Now, the official explanation is that the strikes on Mashhar and Asaluya disrupted production capacity, that domestic industries are running short of raw materials, that the government needs to protect local supply chains. And all of that is true. It is documented. Iranian citizens are describing factory closures and layoffs. There is a nationwide internet shutdown. Iran's central bank sent a private assessment to President Pezeshkian, warning that the war's economic damage could take up to 12 years to repair. 12 years. That is not a country in temporary distress. That is a country that has been fundamentally damaged and knows it. So here's the question I want you to sit with. A country that has just been told by its own central bank that it needs 12 years to recover, that country's first major economic decision is to stop exporting, to close itself off from the revenue that normally comes in, to turn inward. Why? The simple answer is domestic necessity, and that is partly true. But the simple answer does not explain the timing. The strikes happened in early April. The ceasefire was already in place, and then the blockade began. The directive came the same day as the blockade, not a week later, not after negotiations failed, the same day. That is not coincidence. Iran did not try to fight through the blockade. Iran did not try to negotiate around it. Iran turned its economy inward the same moment the blockade went up. And that specific move, same day, same direction, no hesitation, is the one that China recognizes. Here's the second thing. America is calling this a victory. Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium and said, and I want you to hear the exact words, "While you are digging out, we are only getting stronger." He said the blockade is the polite way this can go. He said the US is locked and loaded on Iran's power grid, its energy infrastructure, its civilian electricity supply. And then he said, the sentence I want you to hold on to, you can't control anything. Now, I want to steelman this position before I explain why I think it misses something important. Because Hegseth is not wrong about the economic pressure. The blockade is working in the narrow sense. Ships have been turned back. The squeeze is tightened. Iran's export revenues are under severe pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The 12-year central bank assessment is real. The factory closures are real. The internet shutdown is real. America has done serious sustained economic damage to Iran. Hegseth is right about the numbers. What Hegseth may be wrong about is what those numbers produce. Here is the framework I want to use. I call it the cornered state pattern. It works like this. When you apply maximum pressure to a country that is already damaged, you create one of two outcomes. Either the country concludes that surrender is cheaper than resistance and it negotiates, or the country concludes that waiting means certain defeat and it makes its most dangerous move while it still has the capacity to make it. The difference between those two outcomes is not the amount of pressure. It is the country's calculation about whether resistance is still survivable. The moment a government believes survival is no longer possible through waiting, the pressure stops creating negotiation. It starts creating the conditions for the most dangerous move. Now, most people assume that more pressure always pushes a country closer to the first outcome. That is the assumption behind every blockade, every sanctions regime, every escalation in modern history. It is the assumption behind Hegseth's statement. You can't control anything, make them feel completely powerless, and they will negotiate to regain something. That assumption is sometimes correct. It was correct with Libya in 2003. It was correct with South Africa in the 1980s. It was correct with Myanmar on certain issues, but it is not always correct. The cases where it is not correct share a common feature. The country under pressure had already made a calculation quietly, internally, before any public announcement, that the cost of the dangerous move was now lower than the cost of continuing to absorb the pressure. That calculation is almost never visible from the outside in advance. It is only visible in retrospect. After the move has been made, analysts go back and find the signals, the economy turning inward, the supply chains being protected, the domestic industries being prioritized over export revenue, all of it pointing in the same direction, all of it ignored at the time because the side applying the pressure was watching the numbers and calling them a win. America has been betting since the blockade began that Iran is in the first category. China, watching from Beijing, is not sure Iran is in the first category, and China has more experience reading that calculation than anyone else in this conflict. Here is the third thing. China has seen this before. I want to go back 85 years. Not because history repeats exactly, it does not, but because the structural signature of what a country does before its most dangerous move appears across centuries. In July 1941, the United States imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. Japan was dependent on American oil for roughly 80% of its military fuel. The American calculation was straightforward. Cut off the oil. Japan cannot fight. Japan negotiates. America wins without firing a shot. For several months, Tokyo appeared to be negotiating. American and Japanese diplomats were meeting, proposals and counterproposals. During the entire period of those negotiations, Japan was quietly doing something that American intelligence either did not see or did not understand the significance of. Japan was turning its economy inward, redirecting industrial output toward domestic military production, securing domestic supply chains, preparing its population for an extended period of self-reliance. The outward signals said negotiation. The inward signal said something else entirely. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. I am not saying Iran is about to attack an American base the way Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. I am saying the cornered state pattern has a specific signature, and that signature includes turning the economy inward, protecting domestic supply, cutting off export revenue, because you have already decided that what comes next is not going to be a trading relationship with the outside world. China's strategic tradition has studied this pattern for generations, not because China is hawkish, but because China has watched empires corner countries and then be shocked by what those countries do. China knows exactly what it looks like when a state stops playing by the rules of the global system and starts playing by the rules of survival. And China has 1.22 billion barrels of strategic crude reserves, built over 2 years from sanctioned Iranian and Russian oil, positioned precisely so that when the moment came, China would not be the country scrambling for supply. That reserve was not built in reaction to this war. It was built in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. Think about what that preparation actually means. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Brent crude spiked past $120 a barrel, China did not panic. Its markets remained stable. Its refineries kept running, while Japan, South Korea, Germany, and the United Kingdom were scrambling for alternatives. While Europe was discovering it had 6 weeks of jet fuel left, China was sitting on 120 days of supply cover at normal import levels. The International Energy Agency described this as the largest energy crisis the world has ever faced. China called it a manageable situation. That gap in reaction is not luck. It is the product of a decade of deliberate positioning that most Western analysts spent years calling excessive caution. And China built something else over that same decade specifically to survive exactly this kind of American pressure. China has been buying Iranian oil through what analysts call the dark fleet system, ships that turn off their tracking transponders, payments in yuan, not dollars, second-tier Chinese banks that operate outside the SWIFT financial network that American sanctions rely on, Chinese refineries called teapots that process sanctioned oil without asking questions. China built this entire architecture specifically so that when America tried to use economic pressure to cut Iran off, the system would hold, and the system has held. Iran has been exporting oil above its pre-war average through the darkest weeks of this conflict because China built the infrastructure to make that possible years before the first American bomb fell. China is watching Iran right now, not because it wants Iran to make a dangerous move. China does not want that. China needs Hormuz open. China's refineries depend on Iranian oil. China wants to use those 120 days of cover as negotiating time, not as emergency supply. But China also understands something Washington appears not to understand. The way you pressure a country into making a deal is completely different from the way you pressure a country into making its most dangerous move. And right now, the evidence suggests America is doing the second thing while believing it is doing the first. Now, I want to raise the question that I think nobody in mainstream coverage is asking directly, because I think it is the most important question this situation raises. If Iran is reading the cornered state pattern the way China reads it, if Tehran has concluded that the window for its most dangerous move is closing, then what does turning the economy inward actually signal? It does not signal surrender. Countries preparing to surrender do not redirect supply chains. They do not protect domestic industries. They do not issue directives to return uncleared export cargoes. They look for the fastest path to a deal. Turning the economy inward signals preparation. It is what you do when you have decided that what comes next is going to require everything you have domestically, and that exporting to the outside world is a luxury you can no longer afford because the outside world is about to become much more hostile. And here is where China's parallel move matters. When Iran turned its economy inward, Chinese refiners, including Sinopec, were already under government instruction to stop accepting new fuel export contracts. China was running parallel to Iran, both countries at the same moment making the same structural adjustment, redirecting supply inward, reducing exposure to the global trading system America controls. That parallelism is either coincidence or coordination. And given that Araghchi confirmed military cooperation with Russia and China still continues, given that Lavrov was in Beijing meeting Xi just days ago, given that Russia is providing Iran with satellite intelligence, the likelihood that this is pure coincidence is very low. The Washington Post described it precisely. China and Iran weaponized the global economy to beat America at its own game. America once had a near monopoly on economic warfare. That monopoly has been broken. And the way it was broken, through years of patient, quiet system building that most Western analysts dismissed as noise, is exactly how China operates when it has decided which direction history is moving. There are three paths from this moment. The cornered state pattern tells us what each one looks like. The first path is the Libya path. Muammar Gaddafi in 2003 looked at the pressure he was under, looked at what had just happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and concluded that a deal on American terms was better than any alternative. He surrendered his weapons program entirely. He survived for another 8 years. He remained in power. This is the path Hegseth believes Iran is on. It is possible, but Libya was not facing 12 years of reconstruction. Libya had not had its supreme leader assassinated on day one. Libya did not have over 3,000 documented civilian deaths from 40 days of bombing. Libya did not have a 1.22 billion barrel Chinese strategic partner sitting on the outside of the pressure, buying its oil through a system specifically engineered to be unreachable by American enforcement. The structural conditions that made the Libya path work for Gaddafi do not all exist for Iran right now. The second path is the Japan path. Iran concludes, exactly as Japan concluded in 1941, that the window for its most dangerous move is closing, that waiting means certain defeat, that acting now, while it still has fast attack boats in the water, mines in the strait, missile capability in tunnels that American bombs could not fully destroy, Hormuz control, and proxy networks from Yemen to Lebanon, acting now gives it a chance that waiting does not. What would Iran's most dangerous move look like? It does not have to be a direct military confrontation. It could be releasing the Houthis in Yemen to resume full Red Sea operations simultaneously with Gulf operations, creating two choke points at once, affecting 30 to 40% of global seaborne trade. It could be a decision about uranium enrichment that crosses a threshold the entire world has been watching. The nature of the cornered state pattern is that the move is always something the pressure side says the country would never do, because the pressure side keeps calculating based on the cost it would bear, not the cost the cornered state has already decided it can absorb. The petrochemical halt, the inward economic turn, the parallel Chinese supply chain adjustment, these point directionally toward this path, not inevitably, but the signal is there, and it is not subtle. The third path is the one China is actually working toward, a negotiated settlement that lets both sides claim something, opens Hormuz, and allows China's strategic reserves to become a permanent energy relationship rather than an emergency buffer. China is pushing through Pakistan, through Turkey, through every back channel available. China told the White House it will not send weapons to Iran. Whether that is true or not, saying it buys diplomatic space and keeps China at the table in Washington's calculations. China's bet is that if it can get both sides to a table before the ceasefire expires, the outcome is a deal that looks like a draw but functions like a Chinese strategic victory. Iran survives. Hormuz reopens. America declares victory. China gets permanent structural energy independence from American maritime control, which is the thing China has been building toward for a decade, and which the power of Siberia 2 pipeline, now appearing in China's official 5-year plan, would cement permanently. That is a very good outcome for China, and China is working hard to produce it. That third path is possible, but it requires Iran to believe it has more to gain from a deal than from escalation. And right now, the signal Iran is sending is not the signal of a country preparing to accept a deal. The cornered state pattern ends one of two ways. The country negotiates from exhaustion, or the country makes its move. China knows which signals indicate which outcome. China is watching those signals in real time. America is watching the oil price and calling it a win. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. The second round of talks has no confirmed date and no confirmed location. The petrochemicals are turned off. The economy is pointing inward. The same structural adjustment is running in parallel in Beijing. And Hegseth stood at the Pentagon and told Iran it controls nothing. I want to be clear about one thing before I close. I am not predicting Iran is going to make its most dangerous move. I am saying the signals that precede that move in the historical pattern are present. I am saying China can read those signals, and Washington does not appear to be reading them the same way. And I am saying the gap between what America is concluding from the pressure it is applying and what China is concluding from the same facts is the most important gap in this entire conflict right now. Not the gap between Iran and America at the negotiating table. The gap between Washington and Beijing, and how they are reading what Iran is actually doing. Watch what Iran does not do in the next 96 hours. Not what it says, what it does not do. Because the most dangerous signal in the cornered state pattern is not a threat, it is a silence. A decision made in a room in Tehran that nobody announces. The kind of decision that looks from the outside like a country still negotiating and looks from the inside like a country that has already decided. China knows that silence. It has seen it before. Push back on this. If you see it differently, read the Iran International Assessment on the 12 years of economic damage. Read the Washington Post piece on how China and Iran weaponized economic warfare against America. Read the oil price report on the petrochemical halt. Read what Hegseth said at the Pentagon podium. And then ask the question that nobody in Washington appears to be asking. What does a nation do after it seals off its economy, only to be told by the most powerful military on earth that it controls nothing? History offers a sobering answer. When a state feels truly cornered, it rarely responds the way its adversaries expect. It does not simply bend. It recalculates. And once that calculation is made, once leaders conclude that waiting is more dangerous than acting, the entire strategic equation changes. Pressure no longer drives compromise. It can drive escalation. That is the essence of the cornered state pattern. Again and again, the side applying the pressure assumes that greater force will produce surrender. Yet history often shows the opposite. When a nation believes its options are running out, it may choose its boldest, riskiest, and most consequential move precisely because it sees no safer alternative.